McRae, settle down.
The U.S. did away with the military draft in 1971. The all-volunteer force that followed took nearly a generation to come to full fruition. The first test of that military in combat wasn't until the early 1990s. The reasons why someone would volunteer for military service are as varied as the men and women who serve. For some, it was a lifelong dream.
It was something I'd always thought about all through high school. Often thought about, the various branches of the military in which I would like to join. I really like the Army. I have some family that's in the Army. Always talked myself out of it until, just after I finished college, my younger brother enlisted in the National Guard, and I decided, if he can do it, why not? So I just went to the recruiter, took the ASVAB, and signed up that night.
For Bennie McRae, it was the big boy toys he could play with.
I joined, I came on active November 21st, 1988, and I joined because I always wanted to be a tanker. That was my dream. I remember after high school, I went to the recruiter to ask if I could join the Army, and he had his quota for that month. And I told him I wanted to be a tanker. He said, well, I have my quota, come back next month. My parents told me to go to college instead. So I went to college, went to ROTC, and first day in ROTC, I was like, I want to be a tanker. And they laughed at me because they said, well, we make you an officer here first, and that comes later. And so I went through ROTC, and tanking was my first choice when we had to list our choices of what we wanted to do in the Army, and I got it.
For one 30-year veteran, Sergeant Major Otis Smith, it was because he had nothing better to do.
I came in the military in 1975 after a year of working, doing some odd end things. I had some scholarships to go to college to play football, but I was kind of young and wild and didn't want to go to school any longer. So I worked for about a year and came to the military in March of 1975. Came in back then as 11 Delta Romeo 8, which was a Scout on a Sheridan vehicle.
Or they joined for the adventure.
I grew up on a farm, more or less. It was tobacco farmers. My dad was also a construction contractor, so, you grew up doing a lot of hard labor. And, I didn't really want to do hard labor for the rest of my life. So, I wanted a little adventure, so that's why I went into the Army. To get a little experience and adventure. Went into combat arms. At the time, I didn't think, that doesn't give you experience for a lot of stuff to do in the real world, but, it was a lot of fun and a lot of adventure, and I don't think I would have done it any other way now. But that's why I went into the Army.
Joined the Marine Corps in February 1994. After a semester of college, I decided that when I didn't make the soccer team, it wasn't exciting enough, and I always remember the Marine recruiter promising adventure, so signed up for the infantry.
That choice may have had something to do with family history.
My grandfather, on my dad's side, was in World War II, really just for, just for the war, about, I think, 3-4 years. My great-grandfather was a medic in World War I on my grandmother's side, but he stayed here because he was a doctor, so there wasn't really any family background. Actually, my parents thought they'd screwed up when I showed them the enlistment papers, and my grandfather thought I was crazy because the Japanese supposedly kept him from going to college, and by God, he was actually paying for my college education then, and he wanted to put me through school. And so they were both very surprised when I showed them my little carbon copy of my enlistment contract.
Two young recruits joined to get college money and discovered a spouse in the military.
I grew up in northwest Pennsylvania, a small town called Cockerton, about 40 miles south of Lake Erie. My father was a railroader. He worked on the railroad for almost 40 years before retiring. I started out in Ohio, which is where I was born, and we moved to Pennsylvania to the rail yard in northwest Pennsylvania, where we moved close to. From age 3 and all of my high school years up until my graduation from high school, I lived there. I entered the military immediately after graduating into the Army. thought about having a career at that point. Wasn't quite sure, and ended up being assigned to the 101st Airborne in Fort Campbell. And that's what brought me at least to the outskirts of Kentucky.
Yes, I grew up in the country in Perry County, Kentucky. I grew up with 4 boys in a pretty rural area. Went to college after high school. I was working full-time and going to college full-time, which was pretty tough, so I got the idea of the Army and decided to join later because I saw it as a ticket for easy college money and a way to serve my country also.
When Mike went into the service, he took his friends with him.
I was actually 15, 16 when I wanted to enlist. It was in those years of high school that we had to start making plans, and college really wasn't on my mind. And at the time, Reagan was the president, and he was putting all the money into the military with college money promises and a lot of bonuses and things like that, and so that's what attracted. And so myself, along with probably 8 of us, we were a small high school. It was 83 in my graduating class, and at least 10% of us, maybe 15%, actually went into the various armed forces after we were graduating and during that summer.
And for others, the reason they joined was more personal.
I'm the youngest of 3. My brother and sister both are older and married and have great little kids who I love being an aunt to. You can shake them up and pass them back. They live in Nashville. My parents still live in the same house we grew up in. Actually, the Marine Corps call came first, but then it just wasn't working. So I went to college thinking, well, maybe later, maybe this won't ever work. My best friend growing up, or one of my very close friends growing up, he joined the Marine Corps, and we had run together all those years and whatnot. And he was killed in a training accident when I was a sophomore in college. And I went to his funeral again, and I just realized that there was still this call to take care of people like him, my friends who I had grown up around, who the majority had all enlisted. I didn't really know a lot of officers at the time. But I was in college, so the officer program just kind of rung true. It finally worked out. And so I guess I'm paying my penance now since I am on recruiting duty. So all the nightmares that I gave the people recruiting me when it kept not working out, I guess I'm getting paid back for that now.
No matter their reasons for joining the military, these young recruits would become part of the largest volunteer army in history and face the test of combat in the Gulf. The Marine Corps is the youngest of all the American military services. The age of the average Marine is around 24 years, and there are nearly 19,000 teenagers in the Corps.
I decided to join the Marine Corps in about January of 1996. I had a friend of mine, a guy that I went to high school with. He was joining the Marine Corps and had called me and said, "Hey man, what are you doing?" I was like, "Nothing." He's like, "Hey, you want to go in the Marine Corps?" I was like, "Man, you're crazy. There's no way I'm going in the Marine Corps." And I was working a dead-end job going nowhere, and my father was in the military. He was in the 101st in Vietnam, and you know, I'd always had the military had always interested me, and so I mulled it over for 2 or 3 days, and then I called him back one morning and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He's like, "I'm sleeping." I said, "Well, I'll meet you over at the recruiters this afternoon." And you know, 6 May 1996, I stood on the yellow footprints down at Paris Island. So I guess the rest is history, as they say.
I always had this love for the Marine Corps and felt that calling. So originally I had hopes to be a public affairs officer, and then I went to the basic school where we pick / get voluntold our MOSs, and I went to Murphy's demo range one day and got to blow stuff up, and I thought, public affairs can wait. We're gonna blow stuff up for a while, so it was pretty neat.
The Marine Corps has always sought to recruit the best of the best in the tradition of the few, the proud.
It was intense. Marine boot camp is intense. I still remember the guy getting on the bus. There was a drill instructor, a staff sergeant, about 6'2" and built like a toothpick. He, you know, it's like you see in the movies, the first and last words out of your mouth will be "sir." He got on there and said, "On behalf of Brigadier General J.D. Humble, I wish to welcome you to Paris Island, South Carolina. The first and last words out of your mouth will be 'sir.' Is that understood?" We all sounded off, and of course it wasn't loud enough, and so we did it again. And he gets off the bus and yells, "Fall out!"
When the new Marines are ushered off the bus at boot camp, often bewildered and exhausted, they perform a lasting tradition. The drill instructor greets them as they get off the bus and orders them to line up, placing their feet on the 4 rows of 15 sets of yellow footprints that are painted in front of the receiving barracks company. From the moment these young men and women step off the bus and plant their feet on the yellow footprints, they are being reshaped into United States Marines.
Oh, it was total culture shock. I was a, middle class, preppy punk kid, long hair, earrings. They actually shaved my head. I looked in the mirror. I didn't know what was looking back. It was a total shock. Put those glasses on. I think I was in culture shock for the full. I think it was 13 weeks then, and I probably didn't come back to normal until I got to the Fleet Marine Force and realized I was still a human being.
Gaggle out on the yellow footprints, and there was a guy in my platoon that was standing next to me, and his last name was Hill, and his head was completely shaved, all except for a tuft of purple hair. And the drill instructor walked up to him and said, "Son, what is that on your head?" He said, "Sir, that's hair, sir." He said, "Bullshit, that's not hair," and grabs him by it. And I thought, he's gonna kill him right here. This is gonna be the first casualty of Parris Island tonight. And a drill instructor walked up to me and said, "Go grab that hatch," and there's 3 sets of double doors. And so I had a 1 in 6 chance of being right, and I was wrong. So I ran up there and opened the hatch. He said, "Not that hatch, the other one." So after a couple minutes, I finally figured out which one he was talking about. And it took me a couple days to realize that they owned everything, because all the drill instructors say, "Close my hatch now, do this, walk past my truck, walk past everything." They owned everything. And it took me a couple days to realize that they actually didn't own everything on base. It was just their speak, how they were, I guess, transforming us from, Joe the civilian to United States Marine.
In the weeks that follow, they absorb the common tasks of military life. They learn to march and talk like Marines. They learn how to take care of themselves and their uniforms and equipment. And since every Marine is a rifleman, they learn how to handle and care for their M16A2 as if it were an extension of their body.
But, boot camp was just, go to bed, go to eat, go to the bathroom whenever they told you to. Light comes on in the morning, jump out of the bed and get ready for the next day. That was it. It's probably the only time I routinely went to church every Sunday just to get a break. But for some aspects, that was a good part of boot camp. I never missed a day of church. But other than that, it was just, I was just there to get through with it and get out of there.
Well, boot camp is, I would say, probably about 85 to 90% mental and about 10% physical. If you want to be there, if you have the mental tenacity to say, "Man, I'm leaving here one of 2 ways, in a bag and dead, or as a Marine," you're going to make it, unless you just have some kind of physical injury that prevents you from success.
The final weeks take the recruits to the Crucible. It is a severe test of patience and fortitude and is the final trial of Marine recruit training. The Crucible emphasizes teamwork under stress. The recruits get 8 hours of sleep during the entire 54-hour exercise. They march 40 miles in those 54 hours and receive 2.5 MREs, meals ready to eat, which they must ration to last the entire exercise. The Crucible is designed to test the recruits to their utmost and to teach them that it is together rather than alone that they are unstoppable.
There are those circumstances. There are people that go to Parris Island or go to San Diego or go to Quantico to become Marines, and some ill fate befalls them and they are not successful in their campaign. I get that. But a vast majority of people that go to boot camp or want to become Marines are not successful. It's not because they have physical limitations as much as it is mental limitations, because they lack the desire to accomplish that task. And maybe it's the Marine Corps or the Marine in me talking, saying, hey, there is no option other than success. You go, you do, you succeed, you come home. And maybe the brainwashing has taken effect, but As far for me personally, I think the mental tenacity was there. The physical portion of it was there, but it's completely different. You run a lot on just sheer willpower.
Quantico was it was really awesome. I think, like most things, boot camp or officer candidate school, it's a means to an end. What was good for me is I can run, and I was much, younger, faster, and skinnier then, but I could run pretty fast. So, though I think I was probably the first person in my platoon to get yelled at, I clearly remember the moment in the day. Once we started running, everybody just kind of backed off. I think there's this correlation between people who can run or be physically fit and leadership. Most times it's true, sometimes it's not, but in my favor, I guess it worked out. So they kind of backed off, like, she can run, we'll go yell at somebody else. So I had a blast. It was 10 weeks of a lot of physical training, a lot of just all the things you had seen in every movie or TV show I had heard about from my friends. I mean, I was drinking the bathwater. I was absolutely drinking the Kool-Aid, and still do, I guess, to this day. But I loved it. I had a really good time. If, things that you can do and get yelled at and have much pain and all those crazy things Marines do, and we all say we had a great time.
It is a grueling mental and physical challenge that the recruits must pass to become Marines.
I had never taken everything that I owned and put it in a pack and walked 10 miles. So yeah, there were some physical problems there. You get back and your feet are blistered, and it's going to happen. But by and large, I think I was ready. I mean, you can never be ready. You can never be ready. It's like somebody asking you ready to get married? Yeah, I think I am. Well, no, you're not. Well, you're not ready for Paris Island. You're not, well, I can't speak for Quantico, but you're not ready for Paris Island. You may think you're ready, but you're not. You get there and they do what they want to do. They're great at it.
By the time they reach the parade deck, they are shouting the cadence at the top of their lungs and marching in unison. The colors are raised, and there is a short ceremony in which the drill instructor presents each man with an eagle, globe, and anchor. They are now Marines. Kuwait was a close ally of Iraq during the Iraq-Iran War. Kuwait functioned as Iraq's major port for exporting oil and importing goods, once Basra was shut down by the fighting with Iran. When the war ended, the friendly relations between Iraq and its wealthy neighbor turned sour. That cooling of relations soon put Kuwait in Saddam's crosshairs. Kuwait had heavily funded the 8-year-long Iraqi war against Iran. In the end, Iraq was not in a financial position to repay the amount it had borrowed from Kuwait. Iraq argued that the war had prevented the rise of Iranian influence in the Arab world, and that the war had spared Kuwait from the imminent threat of Iranian domination. Hence, since the struggle with Iran had been fought for the benefit of the other Gulf Arab states as much as for Iraq, Saddam argued a share of Iraqi debt should be forgiven. Saddam urged the Kuwaitis to forgive the Iraqi debt accumulated in the war, some $30 billion, but the Kuwaitis refused, firmly stating that Saddam needed to pay off his debts for the war he started. To raise money for post-war reconstruction of his country, Saddam pushed the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, to raise oil prices by cutting back oil production.
Saddam Hussein was annoyed at the Kuwaitis for, in addition, not really providing a lot of assistance that he wanted in terms of the debt relief, but also for violating the production quotas in OPEC, which OPEC is a cartel, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They meet regularly to set production quotas with the idea that they will maintain price stability. So if any of the member states are violating the production quotas, potentially that's going to have an adverse effect on all the rest of them, because either they can choose to sell less oil or they can see the price go down. So if you're trying to generate revenue to pay back debt, you need to maximize the price of oil, which so Saddam was annoyed at Kuwait for that particular reason as well.
Kuwait's resistance was seen by many in Iraq as an act of aggression, further distancing the countries. It was estimated that Iraq lost $14 billion a year due to Kuwait's oil price strategy. During late 1989, several official meetings were held between the Kuwaiti and Iraqi leaders, but they were unable to break the deadlock between the two. To add to this powder keg was Iraq's claim that Kuwait was siphoning oil from the shared Rumaila oil field straddling the Iraq-Kuwait border. Kuwait dismissed the accusations as a false Iraqi ploy to justify military action against it. Several foreign firms working in the Rumaila field also dismissed Iraq's slant drilling claims as a smokescreen to disguise Iraq's more ambitious intentions. Saddam also showed disdain for the Kuwait-Iraq boundary line. Iraq justified its invasion by claiming that Kuwait was a natural part of Iraq, carved off due to British imperialism. On this count, he may have been correct. On July 25, 1990, only a few days before the Iraqi invasion, OPEC officials said that Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates had agreed to a proposal to limit daily oil output to 1.5 million barrels, thus potentially settling differences over oil policy between Kuwait and Iraq. At the time of this agreement, more than 100,000 Iraqi troops were already deployed along the Iraq-Kuwait border, and there was little indication of decline in tensions despite the OPEC agreement. Though Saddam needed oil money to stem a looming economic crisis, he still had an experienced and well-equipped army and was willing to use it. After 23 years in power, Saddam Hussein imagined himself a world player. The Iraqi dictator had used his country's enormous oil revenues and strategic location to entrench himself as a regional force. During a long and bloody war with Iran in the 1980s, Saddam had assembled the world's fourth largest army and equipped it with modern arms. However, the long war with Iran proved costly. When it ended, Iraq was $80 billion in debt. To pay for that war, Saddam turned his eyes toward Kuwait.
Supposedly in July of 1990, when Saddam Hussein already had sort of Kuwait in the gun sights, if you will, he met with the United States ambassador, a woman named April Glaspie, and allegedly, and there have been some transcript released of this, some of it from the Iraqi side, and I've seen, I think, unofficial of the U.S. side of the transcripts, where basically Ambassador Glaspie said the United States takes no position on Arab conflicts. And then around that same time, the State Department released a statement that made it quite clear that the U.S. had no formal alliance obligations to Kuwait, which would suggest that if Kuwait were attacked, the United States would have no responsibility to come to its defense, which wouldn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't come to its defense, because obviously, as we found out under the UN Charter, anybody under collective defense can come to the defense of a country that's attacked in that way. But, and the U.S. is, of course, a major member state of the United Nations, but those were both certainly mixed signals that some people say may have had an effect influencing Saddam Hussein's decision to go against Kuwait.
Well, I don't think we gave any signals that the invasion of Kuwait would be acceptable, but we did basically support Iraq during the war with Iran. Iran was, I think from Washington's perspective, a pretty deadly enemy at that point after having taken the hostages and not having any relations. And we provided some support to Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. And we sold grain. I'm not certain if I think we maybe sold weapons too. But perhaps he felt that, well, with America backing him, that we would not be adverse to his going into Kuwait.
I think that the opposite might have had a different effect. If the United States had clearly signaled it would be wrong to attack Kuwait, and under the United Nations Charter, it's illegal for any state to challenge the territorial integrity of another, and the United States is obliged under the United Nations Charter and as a member state of the Security Council to, help to assure the defense of those states, who knows, that might have had the opposite effect of restraining Saddam Hussein. So I think it might be too strong to say it encouraged him, but it might be fair to think about the counterfactual of what would have happened had the U.S. said something completely different.
On August 2, 1989, 2 Iraqi divisions crossed the Kuwaiti border. A 3rd division launched a supporting attack further to the west. Meanwhile, Iraqi special forces mounted heliborne and amphibious raids on strategic targets in Kuwait City. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, it was all over. Within hours of the invasion, Kuwaiti and U.S. delegations requested a meeting of the UN Security Council, which passed Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding a withdrawal of Iraqi troops. On August 6th, UN Resolution 661 placed economic sanctions on Iraq. United Nations Security Council Resolution 665 followed soon after. It authorized a naval blockade to enforce the economic sanctions against Iraq. It allowed for the use of measures commensurate to the specific circumstances as may be necessary to halt all inward and outward maritime shipping in order to inspect and verify their cargoes and destinations and to ensure strict implementation of Resolution 661.
There was some fear that the next stop might be Saudi Arabia, which would be a much bigger player. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the dominant state within OPEC because it produces an enormous percentage of the world's oil, and more importantly, it is the reservoir, or certainly was, you know, we're talking almost 2 decades, well, we are talking about 2 decades ago, that it was, you know, the source of much of the world's oil reserves. And so no one wanted to see, you know, that oil threatened in that way.
What was really at issue for the U.S. was, and this kind of goes back to the Carter Doctrine, of having somebody who is not controllable in charge of so much of the world's oil. Because being positioned in Kuwait, the next target logically would be Saudi Arabia. And so that would give Saddam Hussein control over about 40% of the world's reserves. And that was just too much to tolerate.
For President George H.W. Bush, there was only one possible response to what he called naked aggression. One of the most important UN resolutions was Resolution 678, passed on November 29, 1990, which gave Iraq a withdrawal deadline of January 15, 1991, and authorized all necessary means to uphold and implement Resolution 660, authorizing the use of force if Iraq failed to comply. Acting on the policy of the Carter Doctrine, and out of fear the Iraqi army could launch an invasion of Saudi Arabia, U.S. President Bush quickly announced that the U.S. would launch a wholly defensive mission to prevent Iraq from invading Saudi Arabia under the name Operation Desert Shield.
Today, as president, I ask for your support in a decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
Saddam invaded Kuwait in August, I think early August, of 1990, and the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, they took the next, 5-6 months to work with the Allies. It was considerably different than what George W. Bush did when he invaded Iraq in 2003.
The United States assembled a coalition of forces to join it in opposing Iraq's aggression, consisting of forces from 34 countries. U.S. Army General Norman Schwarzkopf was designated to be the commander of the coalition forces in the Persian Gulf area.
It was, I think, a fairly skillful diplomacy on the U.S. part, and a different notion than what we saw later, too, a notion simply of building a multilateral coalition, getting the Saudis to fund a good part of it, getting some of the NATO allies to come in and provide troops, weapons, and so forth, but the U.S. bearing the bulk of it.
Many of the coalition forces were reluctant to join. Some felt that the war was an internal Arab affair or did not want an increase of U.S. influence in the Middle East. In the end, however, many nations were persuaded by Iraq's belligerence towards other Arab states, offers of economic aid or debt forgiveness, and threats to withhold aid.
Probably the lingering phrase from that building of the coalition was this phrase, Operation Tin Cup. You've probably seen images from film, right, where somebody's turning a grinder and there's maybe a monkey or a person holding a tin cup out to have the money go in. That was what the unofficial name was for Secretary of State James Baker going around the world convincing other states that it was the right thing to do to stop Saddam Hussein then and to help finance that operation. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Germans, and the Japanese, just those 4 states financed, I think, about 2/3 of the first Persian Gulf War. And then other states made contributions as well. So there was an enormous commitment by the U.S. of military force and troops, but there was a genuine coalition of nearly 30 states with troops in the area and lots of money coming in from various places. I mean, the Germans and the Japanese are much more dependent upon oil from the Middle East than the U.S. is. The U.S. buys, and did at the time, bought more oil from closer sources such as Mexico and Venezuela, from Africa. Europe's very dependent upon the Middle East, and Japan was very dependent upon the Middle East. So they had supply and price issues in mind, and of course the Saudis and the Kuwaitis had direct personal, I mean, these are kingdoms, so they had personal interest, national interest, however you want to frame it, in helping form this coalition. So most of this was done through the auspices of the United Nations. The U.S. as a permanent member of the Security Council. The difficult question was whether or not the Russians were going to make a stink about it, because essentially the Cold War was winding down, but it wasn't yet completely over. And as I mentioned previously, Iraq had purchased most of its weapons from the Saudis. It had ties. It was ambiguous what the Soviets were going to do about voting at the UN Security Council on the question. But other than that barrier, it was actually fairly easy to put together that coalition. It wasn't the entire world necessarily, because it was a decision made on the Security Council, which is made up of 15 states, 5 of which are permanent, so really only a set of 10 representing the rest of the world. But it was a significant accomplishment.
Boot camp turned the recruits into Marines, but their training was far from complete. After a short leave, they report to the School of Infantry. The school turns Marines into warriors. No matter what their job in the Marine Corps, from public affairs to motor transport mechanic, every Marine is trained to be first and foremost a rifleman.
After I left Camp Lejeune, I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama. I was there for approximately 3 months going through military police school. I had a rather enjoyable time, was learning the MOS, but soon realized that there's 2 separate fields to military police. There's the base MPs, which is the regular cop, and then there's the field MP, which is anything but a regular cop. You've got, your life revolves around being mechanized pretty much. You're a grunt with a Humvee, almost. You spend a lot of time training with weapon systems, machine guns, learning field tactics and craft. Spend a lot of time just basically how to handle yourself in a combat situation. So when you tell somebody that you're an MP, they immediately think, oh, you were on base writing tickets. I've never written a citation or taken the grunts to and detained them or called their staff duty or anything else like that. I've always worked as a field MP.
I think at OCS you get leadership. I mean, I think everything you do there is the foundations of leadership. You obviously get all the technical skills and some basic tactical skills. You learn your drill, you learn how to wear a uniform, you learn rank structure. Some of these things you may learn because you studied it before you went down, but you learn all your basic information about the Marine Corps there. That's where you learn how to be a basic rifle platoon commander. You learn your basic tactics, you learn all the weapon systems, or your basic weapons as far as your heavy machine guns, your medium machine guns. You learn land navigation, you learn your squad and platoon level tactics. You learn some basic call for fire, all those things that everybody, kind of like every Marine is a rifleman, well, every Marine officer is a provisional rifle platoon commander is kind of the mantra.
The modern Marine Corps Basic Fighting Unit is the Infantry Battalion. It is the Infantry Battalion as the building block from which all large units are assembled. Seldom does an entire regiment deploy or fight as a complete entity. Today, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, MEU, is deployed most often. The Marines developed MEUs and made them special operations capable. 2 MEUs are usually afloat at any one time. They are America's 911 force, able to respond to any worldwide emergency in a matter of days and carrying everything they need to cope with any contingency.
A MEU is a Marine Expeditionary Unit. A MEU is our first line of defense, or our ready line of defense, that you hear about them often, who float around and wait to be called up. Oftentimes, the MEUs, on each coast there's one out, one getting ready to go, and one on its way back for the East and West Coast, and then there's one in Okinawa. The MEU is what often responds to things like, probably in Haiti, also the earthquakes, the floods, all those major devastating things that happen around the world, as well as a lot of times they're your first line of defense. If there's some sort of conflict, that they'll be in there. It really truly defines the expeditionary from the sea and our amphibious nature. That's what we're built around.
The MEU's ground combat element is basically a Marine infantry battalion. They are supported by a platoon of assault amphibian vehicles, a platoon of tanks, light armored vehicles, and an artillery battery.
I think the Marine Corps is designed, we just want to put our enemy on the horns of a dilemma. I mean, if you come at us from the front, we're going to hit you from the front, but we're going to hit you from the side. I think what we do is it's combined and integrated. We strive to not make anything linear, but we want to hit you in a three-dimensional battlefield.
Each MEU also has an air combat element, which contains a handful of just about every type of aircraft in the Corps' inventory.
As we build all our plans, all our battle plans, we figure out how to integrate that air support. So there's call for fire, there's immediate close air support. We prep the battlefield with a deep fight, and I mean, it probably got its origins in World War II as you prepped Iwo Jima and flew over and bombed the heck out of it. It's no different concept, where you're prepping the battlefield, you're doing some prep fires, and then you roll in for the heavy attack.
Trained, equipped, and ready for action, Marines of the MEU and reservists from around the world knew that they were going to war against Iraq. For the U.S. troops that were to be the bulk of this coalition, deployment to the Gulf came as a huge surprise.
We never heard of the country. What's Kuwait? What's so great about it that it's part of our national security? We started learning about the resources and started learning about Saddam Hussein's capability. And at first we thought it was just like another piece of news story. Somebody invaded somebody around the world, but as time went on, we started getting more and more news trickled down to us that this was becoming a more and more serious matter, and more maybe involved than just what we see on TV.
I was young. I didn't really know what a lot of people knew, the older people, which I came to find out, like Iraq and Iran fighting for 7 years, and then you start thinking, you're like, these guys have been fighting for 7 years. They're battle hardened, and I'd say there's some anxiety, but I mean, it wasn't really noticeable. We didn't have a problem with soldiers going AWOL or anything like that. People just started buckling down and doing what they had to do.
This wholly defensive doctrine was quickly abandoned when on August 8th, Iraq declared Kuwait to be the 19th province of Iraq. On August 9th, after a 14-hour flight, a group of 25 F-15s touched down at Saudi airfields. As the F-15s began their air patrols, the first units of the 82nd Airborne Division arrived in Daugherty and began setting up defensive positions. The rest of the formation soon followed, but they faced an Iraqi concentration in Kuwait of 130,000 troops, 1,200 tanks, and 800 artillery pieces. Along with the airborne troops, the legendary 1st Marine Division formed the nucleus of the massive seaborne force sent in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. An Iraqi offensive into Saudi Arabia would have required the 82nd and the Marines to fight a defensive delaying action.
Well, the primary goal at the time we were moving into the country and getting established, the primary objective was what they called the defense of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Our job was, we saw that Saddam had put the Iraqi forces up along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border. It looked like they were going to come at us, so what kind of plan could we come up with to thwart any kind of attack that would come into the theater?
As at Guadalcanal and the rush to Korea, the U.S. Marines were ordered to scrape together the tools of war to face a formidable foe. Facing overwhelming odds, the troops referred to themselves as Iraqi speed bumps.